These are the answers to our worksheet. Now, you certainly can look at the PDF on your own, but if you'd like to have my explanation, listen to the video. So the first one reads, we were shocked about the senior trip to Boston, but on the other hand, not everyone was surprised at the school's decision on prom. Well, I recognize that I have a compound sentence. This word but lets me know that I have a compound sentence, so I should probably put a comma there. I notice that B has a comma and so does D. But B has this weird comma after the word but, whereas D just simply says comma but, a brand new sentence starts. On the other hand, not everyone. On the other hand, could be looked at as a long enough prep phrase. It could also be looked at as a transition or a conjunctive adverb, a way of just sort of joining those two thoughts together with a sort of a transition. So I like the comma. The other reason is I never put a comma in front of it, always just simply afterward. So once I do comma but, I'm starting a brand new sentence, and therefore I just jump right into it. D is my answer. Number 2 is really important. Angrily, Cyan slammed down her test and with her evil eyes stared down Mrs. Shockey. Well, there are no changes on this one. One thing I want you to recognize is I don't want to fall for B or C. I don't want to put a comma after angrily. This is not rule number 3. This is just rule number 1, where I have an adverb describing the verb. It tells us how she slammed down her test, angrily. It tells us how she stared down Mrs. Shockey, angrily. It's not telling us the whole sentence is angry. It's not like the word unfortunate or lucky or ironic. This is just an adverb describing how she slammed down her test and how she stared at Mrs. Shockey. She just did it in a very angry way. So therefore, there's no comma after angrily, and there's certainly no comma after the word test. That's not a compound sentence. Answer is A. Number 3, before waking, Weston had a horrific nightmare about frozen banana stands in English class. Well, this is one of those situations where, for clarity's sake, I'm going to put a comma after waking. Technically, it's a short prep phrase, before waking, and rule number 1 says don't put a comma after waking. Yet rule number 2 says you might misread the sentence. You might misread it as before waking Weston, and you're not waking Weston. You're simply saying before waking, Weston had a horrific nightmare. And so therefore, to clarify, I'm going to put a comma after waking. So I like B. Number 4, because Hunter rarely speaks in class, we assume that he is either judging us or trying to make us implode with telepathy. Well, the adverb clause, which starts the sentence, because Hunter rarely speaks in class, is needing a comma after the word class. I can see that in C and D. But I don't want to put a comma after the word us. This is just simply 2 verbs. He is judging or trying, and therefore there's no comma after the word us. The answer is D. On number 5, here's a really long series of prep phrases. I guess not really a long series, it's just 2, without proof of probable cause. And so I have these 2 prep phrases joined together. So I'm going to wait to the very end to put a comma, and then I'm going to continue on with my sentence. So after the word cause, just like B and D, my sentence continues. There's no reason to separate with the bloody gloves with commas on either side. So in this case, B is my answer. Number 6, before class, Joel fixed Alani's overstuffed binder with a bar clamp from the wood shop. I like 6 because he sounds a lot like number 3, Weston's sentence. When I say before waking Weston, you could read it as waking Weston. But what I'm really saying is before waking, Weston had a horrific nightmare. Here it says before class, Joel fixed. It's kind of the same, except it's not. Because I could confuse waking Weston, because you could be waking Weston. But I'm not going to confuse class Joel. Those are not really that confusing. So this is just a short prep phrase, before class, lead me into the word Joel. So there is no need for a comma after before class. So that gives me A and B, and there's certainly no need for a comma after the word binder. This is not a compound sentence or anything weird. It just simply more prep phrases towards the end of the sentence. Your answer is A. Number 7 reads, after high school, Luke changed from classy to hippie because he was easily influenced by the tree-hugging transcendentalists and the hummus salesman at Costco named Moonbeam. Well, one thing I want to keep reinforcing is the adverb clause, when it shows up at the end of the sentence, in this case starts off with the word because, goes all the way to the end. Well, an adverb clause at the end of the sentence never takes a comma, unless it's the word though, even though, although, or as though. This is the word because, and because never gets a comma. Anyone who's ever allowed you to put a comma near the word because, it's because they're still anchoring to old rules from like the 1800s, We don't put commas near the word because anymore. So let's not do that. So it's got to be either C or D. And when I'm down to C and D, I like C. I don't need a comma after high school. That's a short prep phrase. Number 8, as a senior prank, the halls were filled with banana peels, but no one was hurt, luckily. Number 8 and number 2 are very similar because they're testing you on the same or similar concept. First thing I recognize is I have this word but, which goes into a compound sentence. So I definitely want to look at either C or D because I want to put a comma before that word but. I have another sentence right after it. No one was hurt, luckily. So therefore, I don't have to really worry too much about whether it's as a senior prank, comma, or not. This is just, I guess, a long enough prep phrase. I guess I get to put a comma in. You'll notice the real difference between C and D is whether I put a comma after hurt or not. I want you to remember, luckily is one of those weird adverbs, which should probably take a comma. Luckily, unluckily, fortunately, unfortunately, ironically, clearly, obviously, apparently. Those are the kind of adverbs that get commas, not things like happily or angrily. So in this case, luckily tells us that no one was hurt, and that's a very lucky thing. So therefore, it's making a comment about the whole sentence. So therefore, like rule number 3, I'm going to put a comma after hurt. Number 9, throughout her long and tumultuous semester, Whitney always had a smile upon her face. Very traditional, long prep phrase, rule number 1, and therefore a comma after semester. Number 10. According to the recent polls in the news, really long prep phrase, probably I should put a comma after news. That gives me C and D. The public would prefer President Biden to beatbox his State of the Union address and to put his hair in cornrows for the event. Well, in this case, we're preferring two things, to beatbox and to put. Those are just two direct objects, and for that reason, I don't want to put a comma after the State of the Union address. I just simply want to go straight forward through the sentence, and that's why there's no comma after State of the Union address. It's not a compound sentence. Number 11. In order to win the junior class elections, the students demanded more abusive insults and threats from Eric and Cyan hurled at Weston and Luke. Well, in this case, I open up with an infinitive in order to win the junior class elections, so I got to have a comma after elections. But you'll notice that B, C, and D all have commas after elections. That doesn't really help that much. Well, I also notice that the subject changes. The students, Eric and Cyan, the students, but this one added for Eric and Cyan. Think about why I'd want to change that. Well, right now the subject is students. The students demanded, sure, but the students, going backwards, didn't win the junior class elections. Eric and Cyan did. So therefore, I've got to make sure that infinitive works. So if I choose the C choice, which looks really tempting, in order to win senior class elections, somehow I change from junior to senior class. I just realized that. I would say, in order to win senior class elections, Eric and Cyan, but then it wouldn't make sense to say they demanded more insults and threats from Eric and Cyan. What? So what I want to say is D. In order for Eric and Cyan to win senior class elections, the students demanded more insults, and on from there. Number 12. To expect Mr. Marsh to ease up on the rigor in late March was futile and silly. I wanted to put 12 and 11 together because I open up with an infinitive to expect Mr. Marsh to ease up on the rigor in late March. But I also want you to realize that right after this infinitive, I go right into a verb. After this infinitive, I went into a subject. That's how this one's an adverb. It's an adverbial one. This is a nominal one. And therefore, a nominal infinitive never gets a comma. That was from Unit 3. And for that reason, A is my choice. The temptation is to put a comma after March. But we don't want to lose what we learned from our last unit. No commas with nouns. Last Easter, well, this is just an adverbial objective, a noun working as an adverb to start the sentence. And rule number 1 says, don't put a comma after Easter. So last Easter, Natalie had a panic attack when she cracked open the 6-foot chocolate egg in her basket like a piñata to find a family of unbathed hippies inside. Well, in this case, I open up with last Easter, so there's no comma. That's either A or B. But I don't ever want to put a comma before the word when. That's crazy. So therefore, this is an adverb clause at the end of the sentence, which doesn't take a comma. 14. His uncle bought Hunter, without hesitation, a Zamboni, even though he asked for no graduation gifts. Well, the first thing I'm definitely sure of is when I have an adverbial clause with the word though, it always gets a comma. So it's got to be either A or B or D. I also noticed then is in the A choice, it has his uncle bought Hunter, comma, without hesitation, a Zamboni, comma. Well, this comma's hanging out, but he doesn't have a buddy with him. And I noticed that in the D choice, the comma's after hesitation, but he doesn't have a buddy with him. But you'll notice in the B choice, the comma here matches up with the comma here. And therefore, if I'm going to separate without hesitation from the rest of the sentence, I'm going to make sure I put commas on both sides. So I want to contrast sentences which take no commas, like the last one, with sentences which take a lot of commas, like this one. Last one. 15. Cooper stuffed himself with breakfast sausages until he drifted into a coma and rolled onto the floor like a plastic lawn ornament. Another sentence, which is really long, but takes no commas at all. The adverb clause starts off with the word until, goes all the way to the end, but an adverb clause starting with the word until at the end of the sentence never takes a comma. And I never want to separate two verbs with a comma either. So therefore, A is my choice.